What did ordinary life feel like when the sirens wailed and the streets went dark with fear? Imagine a world where ration books replaced dreams and courage hid behind blackout curtains. These British war dramas turned the home front into a battlefield of its own. Lost for decades, now free to stream again, they reveal a quieter kind of heroism, forgotten by time. Number 12. Millions Like Us, 1943. Released at the height of World War II, Millions Like Us became one of the most human portrayals of Britain under siege. It was neither propaganda nor escapism. Instead, it was a mirror held up to factory girls and air raid wardens across the nation. The film followed ordinary women drafted into war production, forced to trade glamour for grease and duty. The premise centered on Celia, a shy young woman who finds herself working at an aircraft factory while her father and sister serve elsewhere. The film weaves small stories of romance and loss into the machinery of total war. There are no battlefields, just rationed tea laughter through exhaustion and the sound of sirens in the distance. When released, the British Ministry of Information praised it for morale-boosting, yet quietly worried it showed too much realism. Some scenes depicting fatigue and factory accidents were trimmed by censors who feared they might dampen public spirit. Critics called it hauntingly honest. American audiences found it too subdued compared to their glamorous war dramas. Behind the scenes, co-directors Sidney Gilliatt and Frank Launder cast real workers alongside professional actors. Shooting in wartime conditions meant constant interruptions by alerts and power cuts. The set was half real factory, half film illusion. Decades later, Millions Like Us resurfaced on television and streaming platforms as an artifact of emotional truth. Its message endures: courage does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it simply clocks in at dawn and keeps the assembly line turning. Number 11. This Happy Breed, 1944. David Lean's This Happy Breed arrived as the bombs were still falling, yet it dared to look backward, not forward. Adapted from Noel Coward's play, it told the story of one London family living through the interwar years, culminating in the Blitz. It was a domestic epic filled with small joys and quiet devastation. The film's premise is deceptively simple. We watch the Gibbons family move into a modest house in Clapham. Over 20 years, they experienced triumphs and losses, from the Great War's aftermath to unemployment marches and the looming terror of Hitler's rise. No battle scenes, no spies, just life itself portrayed with aching sincerity. Censors hesitated. They claimed the film's melancholy tone could hurt wartime morale. Churchill's office reportedly questioned whether audiences should be reminded of pre-war failures. But Lean and Coward insisted on truth. They wanted to show that endurance was not built overnight, it was forged through decades of struggle. Behind the scenes, the film used newly developed Technicolor to paint domestic life in hues of nostalgia. This was Lean's first solo directorial effort, and he treated every kettle and curtain as sacred symbols of British resilience. Actors Celia Johnson and Robert Newton gave raw, unfiltered performances that broke through patriotic polish. Critics were divided. Some called it too sentimental, others called it quietly revolutionary. Over time, it became a hidden masterpiece, its emotions sharper with every generation. This Happy Breed reminds us that heroism sometimes hides behind lace curtains and that every home can be a fortress of memory. Number 10. Went the Day Well, 1942. When Went the Day Well premiered, it shocked British audiences more than any frontline newsreel could. Based on a Graham Greene story, it imagined a nightmare scenario: German soldiers disguised as British troops invading a quiet English village. It was propaganda, yes, but of a uniquely chilling kind, one that blurred fiction and possibility. The premise unfolds with deceptive calm. The villagers of Bramley End welcome uniformed soldiers, believing them to be allies. Only gradually do they realize the truth, and by then it is too late. What follows is a brutal uprising of ordinary people, turning church pews and farm tools into weapons of survival. Censors debated its violence. Scenes of villagers killing invaders with axes and pitchforks pushed wartime boundaries. Some theaters refused to screen it, fearing panic. The government quietly endorsed it as a warning to citizens' trust: no one remain vigilant, always be ready. Behind-the-camera director Alberto Cavalcanti injected documentary realism into the script. He used non-actors and actual rural locals to create authenticity. The film's tone oscillated between pastoral calm and sudden terror. For viewers in 1942, it was both a thrill and a trauma because it felt too real. After the war, it faded from circulation, dismissed as propaganda. Yet modern critics now see it as one of the most daring British thrillers ever made. Its moral remains, timeless evil, does not always arrive in uniform, and sometimes the bravest soldiers are the ones who never left home. Number 9. The Gentle Sex, 1943. The Gentle Sex was released as Britain stood weary yet unbroken. Directed by Leslie Howard, it was part propaganda, part documentary, and part confession. It followed 7 women from different walks of life who joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, where they faced not only the enemy abroad, but the prejudice at home. Each woman arrives with her own assumptions: a socialite, a typist, a country girl, a refugee. Together they form a cross-section of Britain itself, forced to learn discipline and sacrifice. The film dared to show that the home front was not soft, but scarred, that bravery came in uniforms often overlooked. When released, it stirred controversy. Some politicians called it unpatriotic because it depicted doubts and exhaustion among female recruits. Others called it dangerously honest. Scenes of tears, breakdowns, and subtle defiance were trimmed in early screenings. Yet Howard refused to sugarcoat his vision. He died the same year the film premiered, shot down by enemy fire while traveling on a diplomatic mission, making this film his unspoken farewell to his country. Behind the scenes, the cast trained in real Army drills. Many scenes were filmed in genuine barracks under blackout restrictions. Crew members later recalled that the realism was not acted, it was lived. After the war, The Gentle Sex disappeared from theaters for decades, overshadowed by louder male heroics. When rediscovered, it was hailed as a masterpiece of empathy, a reminder that courage sometimes sounds like laughter in a canteen before the next alarm rings. Number 8. The Lamp Still Burns, 1943. The Lamp Still Burns was both a tribute and a rebellion. Produced by J. Arthur Rank, it told the story of nurses during wartime torn between compassion and bureaucracy. Directed by Maurice Elvey and based on a novel by Monica Dickens, the film glowed with realism but also simmered with fury. Its premise followed a young architect who abandons her career to become a nurse. She enters a hospital engulfed by wartime chaos where wounded soldiers lie alongside civilians and supplies vanish faster than hope. What begins as a patriotic drama turns into an exposé of institutional neglect. Nurses faint from exhaustion. Orders conflict with ethics. The lamp of Florence Nightingale flickers under the weight of modern war. Censors bristled. The British Board of Film Censors nearly banned scenes that criticized hospital management and government shortages. Rank's studio was pressured to soften dialogue, suggesting mismanagement in official circles. Some critics accused the film of undermining morale, while others praised it as an act of truth-telling. Behind the scenes, leading actress Rosamund John reportedly clashed with officials who wanted her character made more obedient. Elvey stood his ground. He insisted that honesty was itself a form of patriotism. When released, The Lamp Still Burns divided audiences, but over time it became a touchstone for realism in wartime cinema. Its message endures: the front line is not always distant. Sometimes it lies behind the ward curtains, where light still burns against the dark. Number 7. The Foreman Went to France, 1942. Before Dunkirk became legend, there was a quieter story. The Foreman Went to France, directed by Charles Friend, told of a simple factory manager who risks his life to recover British machinery trapped in occupied territory. It was one of Ealing Studios' earliest war dramas, and it burned with a spirit of ordinary courage. The film's hero, Tom Chadwick, played by Clifford Evans, is not a soldier, but a civilian. When German forces sweep into France, he travels across enemy lines to rescue valuable tools before they fall into enemy hands. What begins as a business trip becomes a battle of conscience. Each choice costs him something: safety, identity, and eventually peace of mind. Government officials initially resisted the project, fearing it might expose supply failures and corporate indecision in early wartime planning. But Michael Balcon at Ealing pushed forward, seeing the story as a symbol of British resolve. Production was difficult. Air raid warnings stopped filming repeatedly. Sets were damaged. Some scenes were completed in bombed London streets, giving the illusion of France without ever leaving Britain. When released, it resonated deeply with working-class audiences. Here was a film that declared that courage was not owned by generals, but by foremen, by clerks, by anyone who refused to surrender dignity. In later years, The Foreman Went to France was overshadowed by grander war films. Yet it remains one of Ealing's most heartfelt tributes to civilian valor, proving that heroism can wear overalls just as proudly as it wears medals. Number 6. Fires Were Started, 1943. Fires Were Started remains one of the most remarkable depictions of the Blitz ever captured on film. Directed by Humphrey Jennings, it blurred the line between fiction and documentary, using real firefighters to recreate their own nightly ordeals. It was not a story of soldiers or spies, but of men who faced war armed only with hoses and courage. The film begins without actors or speeches. We simply watch a new recruit joining a fire brigade in London. He learns the rhythm of alarm bells, the scramble to engines, the blackened skies filled with falling embers. There are no villains, no melodrama, just duty and exhaustion rendered with heartbreaking simplicity. When released, critics called it too realistic. Some theaters hesitated to show it, fearing audiences already weary of bombing might turn away. The government, however, quietly approved it as propaganda disguised as poetry. Jennings's style was revolutionary. He used handheld cameras and non-professional performers, capturing authenticity that no studio could fake. Behind-the-scenes conditions were brutal. Filming took place during actual air raids. Crew members slept in shelters between takes. One fireman featured in the film was later killed on duty, giving the movie an almost sacred weight. Though forgotten for decades, Fires Were Started was rediscovered by film historians who hailed it as a precursor to modern docudrama. Its power lies in silence, in faces streaked with soot, and eyes reflecting flames. It asks a haunting question: what happens to men who must fight the sky itself? Number 5. The Demi-Paradise, 1943. The Demi-Paradise was unlike any other war film. Instead of bombs or spies, it used humor, diplomacy, and heartbreak to bridge nations. Directed by Anthony Asquith, it starred Laurence Olivier as a Russian engineer visiting pre-war England to demonstrate new technology. What begins as cultural satire turns into a subtle political statement about trust and understanding amid chaos. When it premiered, British audiences were puzzled. The film promoted Anglo-Soviet friendship at a time when alliances shifted like tides. Olivier's character, Ivan Kuznetsov, embodies idealism, while the British characters embody suspicion. Through comedy and romance, the film quietly argued that cooperation was as vital as combat. Censors examined every line, fearing political backlash. Some saw it as pro-Soviet propaganda, others as wishful thinking. The government initially delayed its release during delicate wartime diplomacy. Yet, when it finally appeared, it charmed audiences with sincerity and warmth. Behind the scenes, tensions ran high. Olivier, who had just returned from military service, clashed with Asquith over tone and pacing. The Ministry of Information monitored production to ensure no anti-British sentiment slipped through. Still, the finished film radiated humanity. Over time, the Demi-Paradise faded from memory, viewed as a relic of temporary alliance. Yet, decades later, critics reevaluated it as a rare artifact of hope created in the middle of despair. Its legacy reminds us that even in war, the dream of understanding across borders can still flicker, like a lamp refusing to die. Number 4. The Way Ahead, 1944. The Way Ahead was both stirring and brutally honest. Directed by Carol Reed and written by Eric Ambler, it traced the transformation of civilians into soldiers with realism that shook audiences. It followed a group of ordinary British men drafted into service, each reluctant, awkward, and unprepared. By the end, they become a fighting unit, but the journey is marked by fear, not glory. Unlike polished propaganda pieces, The Way Ahead captured mud fatigue and frustration. Its characters argue, curse fate, and learn grudging respect. The dialogue feels spontaneous because it was rewritten daily by the cast, led by David Niven, who drew on his own military experience. Censors loved its patriotism, but worried about its cynicism. Scenes showing recruits mocking officers were almost cut. Reed insisted they stay calling them vital for truth. The result was a film that celebrated discipline without disguising pain. Behind the scenes, production was complicated by real war. Filming was halted when Niven was recalled to active duty. Extras were actual soldiers between deployments. Authentic tanks and artillery were borrowed from bases and returned immediately after shooting. The Way Ahead became a training film for Allied forces, but also a critical success. American critics called it the finest depiction of citizen soldiers ever made. Decades later, it influenced war epics from The Bridge on the River Kwai to Band of Brothers. Its closing line still resonates: they learned the way ahead and never turned back. Number 3. A Canterbury Tale, 1944. Few wartime films dared to be as spiritual or strange as A Canterbury Tale. Directed by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, this quiet masterpiece begins as a mystery and becomes a meditation on faith, resilience, and the English soul itself. It baffled audiences on release, yet decades later, critics hailed it as one of the most profound works ever made about wartime Britain. The story opens with a modern echo of Chaucer's Pilgrims. 3 travelers, a British soldier, an American sergeant, and a young woman, arrive by train in a Kent village blacked out by war. A strange local scandal has erupted. Someone has been pouring glue into the hair of women who walk with soldiers. What begins as absurd comedy evolves into a symbolic quest for understanding amid destruction. The British Board of Film Censors demanded explanations for its surreal tone. Ministry officials were unsure whether audiences would grasp its allegory. Some wartime critics mocked it as irrelevant to the national cause. Yet beneath its odd surface, the film was quietly radical. It suggested that Britain's spiritual survival mattered as much as military victory. Behind the scenes, Powell and Pressburger filmed in real Kent villages still scarred by air raids. Locals acted alongside professionals, lending an eerie authenticity. Deborah Kerr's performance radiated warmth against the bleak backdrop. The directors clashed with the government over its ambiguous patriotism, but stood firm, claiming it celebrated the unseen endurance of ordinary people. When it premiered, American audiences were utterly confused, and distributors re-edited it without consent. Only decades later was the original restored and recognized as visionary art. Today, A Canterbury Tale stands as a hymn to hope, endurance, and the invisible light that guides people home through war's darkest night. Number 2. The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, 1943. When Powell and Pressburger released The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, they were accused of treason. Winston Churchill himself tried to block its distribution, believing it portrayed the British officer class as outdated and weak. Yet what the film truly did was hold a mirror to the soul of a nation torn between tradition and change. The story spans 4 decades following soldier Clive Candy from youthful arrogance to weary wisdom. He fights 3 wars, makes peace with enemies, and watches the world he knew vanish. The tone shifts from humor to heartbreak as Candy learns that honor and decency may be casualties of modern warfare. Censors objected immediately. The script's sympathetic German character alarmed officials. Churchill personally demanded that Laurence Olivier not be cast, fearing the film might soften British resolve. Powell refused to obey and cast Roger Livesey, instead giving one of the greatest performances in cinema history. Behind the scenes, the Archers faced chaos. Funding was nearly withdrawn. Technicolor cameras were scarce. Powell shot in secret at times, using reel bomb damage as sets. Deborah Kerr played 3 roles symbolizing love lost across eras. The final edit ran nearly 3 hours and was trimmed by studios terrified of its boldness. When released, critics were divided. Some called it defeatist, others called it genius. Over time, historians recognized it as one of Britain's deepest films, a meditation on humanity amid shifting morality. It asked the question Britain dared not voice: can decency survive total war? The answer was neither yes nor no, but something far more haunting only if we remember who we once were. Number 1. In Which We Serve, 1942. Before the propaganda machine found its rhythm, one film defined the tone of British resilience. In Which We Serve, directed by David Lean and co-written by Noel Coward, was more than cinema. It was a lifeline. Created during the war's darkest months, it transformed despair into unity and pain into purpose. The story follows the crew of the HMS Torrin, a fictional destroyer inspired by Coward's own experiences. As the ship sinks under enemy attack, flashbacks reveal the lives of its sailors and their families back home. Wives endure bombings, children grow up in fear, yet the bond between home and sea remains unbroken. It was a mosaic of sacrifice that audiences recognized instantly as their own. Censors admired its patriotism, but feared its intensity. The depiction of death and loss was unlike anything seen in wartime film. Some government officials argued it was too sad, too raw. Coward refused to alter a frame, insisting that truth itself was the highest form of courage. Filming was grueling. Naval advisors demanded accuracy in every shot. Real sailors served as extras. Bombing scenes were filmed using live explosions. Coward and Lean clashed repeatedly, but their tension produced art of staggering emotional power. The result felt both epic and intimate, a hymn to endurance sung through tears. When released, it became a national event. Audiences wept in silence as the end credits rolled. Critics hailed it as the film that defined the British spirit under siege. In the decades that followed, it inspired generations of filmmakers, from Lean's later epics to Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. Its message endures through time. Even when everything is lost, the human heart can still serve. These forgotten home-front dramas are not just films, they are fragments of survival, captured in reels of light. Each story reminds us that heroism can bloom in ordinary hearts when the world turns dark. Which of these British treasures moved you the most? Share your thoughts, like the video, and subscribe for more Lost Cinema Reborn.